you can hear us, if you can put into the chat whether you can hear us now, that would be great. Okay, so apparently everybody can hear us now. So I'm not sure how much everybody heard. I'll go over it again. So my name is Christina Whiting. I am the Managing Director at Tevora for the Enterprise Risk and Compliance Practice Area. I am joined by David Grazer, who leads our privacy practice in specific to GDPR. Couple of webinar, etiquette rules. Everybody's on mute except for David and I. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and enter that question into the question section or the chat session. So that way I can go ahead and review those and respond to those throughout the webinar itself. We will be every couple of slides going ahead and taking a break to go ahead so we can respond to the questions that users are asking. That way it's relevant to the topic areas that we're discussing at that time and not waiting until the end, because it is a lot to cover as a whole. If you want to go back a slide so we can go over the agenda again. So the agenda for this afternoon is really going through, what is GDPR? Breaking it down into simplistic terms, looking at it and breaking apart the legalese of the regulation and making sure that people understand what is the intent, how does it impact you, what does it really mean, what kind of data does it cover? We're going to cover all of that. So that way you start to see how GDPR may apply to your organization. From there, we're going to go over requirements, specific requirements that affect IT and security. We broke it out into 8 key areas that organizations should start focusing on immediately and addressing based on the complexity of the implementation, but also too how many facets it touches throughout the organization in regards to specific, IT and security concerns as a whole. From there, we're going to go into what can you really do starting today in order to evaluate your environment for the applicability of GDPR? What can you start doing to make an impact and make sure that you can comply by the enforcement date in 2018? And so we have some key steps and recommendations to go over, so that way it's not as complex as a lot of things in the regulation is making GDPR out to be, but breaking it down into easy phases so that you can start adopting and making an impact today. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to David so that he can start going over the first, which is, what is GDPR? What does it mean? How does it impact me? And what do I need to do?
All right. Well, thank you, Christina, and good morning again, and afternoon to all of those on the line. Thanks for joining us. The one point or idea that we want to drive home more than any other throughout this presentation is that GDPR is more than just a data protection regulation. It affects global economics, trade, and innovation. And you'll see throughout this presentation why that's true and why adopting this perspective is going to help organizations better define their GDPR programs holistically as we get closer and closer to the compliance date. All right, so the foundation. At this point, most of us know that GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. It's an evolution from the Data Protection Directive. And at this point, GDPR has now made the EU Department of Commerce Safe Harbor Agreement null and void. And the real objective of GDPR is to unify data protections for EU data subjects who are not only defined as citizens but residents as well. That's a key determination within the regulation, and it's used throughout the regulation interchangeably.
Yeah, and I think that's a key topic to go ahead and stress here. So GDPR applies to EU residents. And so when we start going through this presentation, we start looking at the data types that are applicable to GDPR, keep that in mind. It's about resident data.
Yes, not just legal citizens. So next, the timing. We believe that May 25th, 2018 should probably be a calendar mark at this point. this is the compliance date. And due to the fact that the Commission released the final text of the regulation in late 2016, they believe that there's been essentially a 2-year grace period. So there will be no argument to the supervisory authorities or the Data Protection Board that you are not in compliance, that you didn't have time. So that's why we are stating that there is no grace period.
And this is different from other regulations that have been released as well, because usually when they go into effect, there's typically about a 6-month grace period. GDPR is taking the stance that there is no grace period. So, every organization that GDPR, falls under and needs to comply with, it does need to have the applicable controls in place and the programs defined by that May 25th, 2018 date.
Yeah, and the last point on this slide is that we want, even if you do business in the UK and you think maybe because of Brexit you won't have to comply, that is not true. They have announced that they will comply and enforce GDPR. So keep note of that. All right, so let's get into some further details here. There are about 8 main trends or topics that we feel are key to understand and key to an organization's success under GDPR. One of those is the DPO, or the Data Protection Officer. Organizations will need to appoint an individual within their company as a DPO, but depending on how core of an activity processing the data subject's information is, will define if this needs to be a full-time or a part-time contracted individual, such as a virtual data protection officer. One of the next trends that we want to point out is the right to erasure, which will be a transition for US-based companies, particularly from an operational standpoint, to fulfill. Basically, this article defines the ability or the right of a data subject to request the erasing or purging of all of their data in your environment. Now, this includes backups, any archival information, anything within the environment. And this is your processors and you as the controller as well. Now, this does conflict with a few US and state regulations, as well as some industry standards. So this will, in order to fulfill this, there will need to be significant cross-functional collaboration. And there are a few exceptions, but we will get into that in later slides in more detail. And then another key component is going to be the transition from an opt-out mindset to an opt-in mindset prior to collecting or gathering data on data subjects. You will need to gain consent to opt in to collect that data. And what that consent looks like is going to depend on the category of data, which again, we will get into in a couple later, in later slides. So most of us at this point are leveraging the cloud to deliver services outside or inside of our organization. So you will need to make sure that you have a good understanding of where that data resides, what that data is, and why it's critical to your business. And that's going to be a trend throughout the presentation and really throughout the implementation of your GDPR programs, is understanding what data you have.
Yeah, and the key to that, I mean, the reason why you want to understand what data you have and the locations that it resides in is because of, certain requirements around the resident, has the ability and the right to go ahead and request, as, Dave was mentioning, that right to erasure. If a resident requests their data to be erased based on certain, stipulations, you need to know where their data resides. And how long you're storing it for and what that looks like. And so that's why you'll see kind of this idea of data mapping and data location and being aware of what's in your environment and where it is in your environment is so vital, and it's a fundamental concept of GDPR and what they're getting at as a whole.
Yeah, and kind of to piggyback off that a little bit further is data controllers, which are essentially the organization as a whole, and the data processors both have obligations under GDPR to ensure that the controls are being met as they've been stated to the data subjects during the consent process. So an understanding of how your cloud infrastructure works, it's architected, and the matrix of responsibilities that are in place is going to be key. Pardon me, wanted to go back one more. So another point that we want to drive home is that GDPR and all of its glory and wisdom does leave a lot of leeway for EU member states to decide upon their own local application of its meaning. Essentially, if a certain member state doesn't believe that the controls that are being prescribed or designated by GDPR, the regulation does leave them the opportunity to enforce stricter age limits for collection of, children data, employee or personnel data, whatever that may be. So the guidance that we have gotten in conversations from lawyers, essentially on the ground, boots on the ground there in the EU, is that adhering to the islands of the EU, essentially the UK rather than the continental areas, is not going to meet the intent of the requirement. So positioning your programs towards German, French, or Spanish controls, and then their local data protection acts is going to serve you long term. And then for companies who do have employees within the EU, this will be vital as the personnel or employment laws will be locally driven. So you will need to understand what the nuances are in those. All right, so codes of conduct here. We just talked about how controllers and processors alike have obligations under the GDPR. And one way to ensure that all parties are covered and adhering to the appropriate controls is going to be a certification or a code of conduct. Now, at this point, certifications are called out in the text of the reg, but nothing further has been discussed. So we hope that at some point that will happen, and we hope that that occurs hopefully in early 2018 prior to the compliance date. But what is evolving rapidly right now are codes of conduct, which are called out within Section 5 of the legislation, if you want to dig in a little bit deeper there. These are agreed upon market best practices or standards that are defined by organizations or parties within a specific marketplace. So right now, there's an EU cloud code of conduct to which cloud service providers or CSPs will adhere. And there's also talks of an executive search code of conduct, which makes sense due to the fact that they collect a plethora of sensitive information. So these codes, and what's great about these codes of conduct is that they will be consistently monitored by an accredited body. That accreditation process is listed out, and these codes of conduct have had to have been approved by the European Data Protection Board and the Supervisory Authority in conjunction.
So the key to these codes of conduct is the fact that it's almost like it's an understanding of, what these organizations, let's look at cloud, because it's something that everybody can connect with and understand and has gone through. And so it's really about what are your expectations of those cloud providers to have certain controls in place in order for you to maintain your compliance with GDPR. It is essentially going to list out what controls they will implement, what responsibilities they will take on, and what responsibilities they expect their customers in order to have in place in order to meet GDPR. So it's almost like, think of it as a responsibility matrix. So it's breaking out GDPR as a whole and those cloud providers under the code of conduct to say, here's what we're going to do to help you meet GDPR, and here's what we're going to have in our environment in order to meet GDPR regulation. And then you need to account for anything that's not listed in that responsibility matrix. And so organizations are, coming together, which I'm sure everybody on this call can assume and laugh at. Obviously, if you get, AWS, Microsoft Azure, all the cloud vendors in a room, they're not necessarily going to agree on everything at one point in time. So it's taking a while for these codes of conduct to be agreed upon and eventually released. So fingers crossed, these will actually be released before the May 25th, 2018 enforcement date. That's what everyone's working for. So nobody knows the date yet when these codes of conduct will be released, but they are being worked on. And it's something for you to start asking your cloud providers, your vendors, are they working on codes of conduct? When do they expect it to be released? As you start looking at your programs as a whole.
All right, so let's summarize. GDPR. So fines can be up to 4% of the annual global revenue. That's the worry. It's going to depend on what the potential infraction was, whether or not that's the assessed penalty, but 4% of global annual revenue is a potential piece. Cloud infrastructure makes GDPR a more complicated regulation, as Christina was just speaking to. So these codes of conduct, that we're seeing evolve, we're hoping that they are a way to ensure a stamp of approval, and that we have that all organizations have a firm grasp on the supply chain that exists within their infrastructure. We need to remember that the intent is about controlling personal information. And then it's good for companies to keep in mind that it's an odd term, but the US does not have what's called an adequacy decision, and we're defined as a third country. So organizations will have to, if they're going to transmit data outside of EU boundaries, you will have to adhere to some type of legal contract. Now that can be what's called a BCR, binding corporate rules. That could be the standard model clauses, or that could be some other type of legal agreement that you're entered into. And those are different things that we can, if you have specific questions with us, please feel free to ping Christina and I about those.
And there's one specific question regarding this topic, and it says, if you only do business in the US, but an EU resident ends up in your data, for instance, they travel to the US, does GDPR apply to that data?
Yes, it does. The question becomes whether or not there's actually going to be true enforcement of that. The way that the regulation is written, that would apply. So if you provide services to someone traveling in the United States, yes, that data being in there requires compliance. However, I think all of us can kind of understand how that seems to be somewhat of a reach, which goes back to why we believe that GDPR is not just about data protection, it's about trade, it's about global economics, and it's about innovation. So yes, is the answer. We'll see how that actually gets applied come May 25th.
Absolutely. So you're going to hear us say, a lot in this presentation. It depends on how they're going to enforce this, come May 25th, because of the fact that with GDPR, there is going to be a certification process. Organizations will need to get certified. However, that certification process has not been released yet. So nobody knows what that certification process looks like, what the expectations are when it comes to any kind of external audits, what exactly are they going to look at, what is the level of rigor, are they going to do a phased approach? These are all up in the air, TBDs, that we are all eagerly waiting on, and we will share that information with everybody as part of this webinar as soon as we receive it, because it will be a vital component of anybody's privacy program in order to meet GDPR as a whole. Now I want to pause again because we do have another question that's in regards to data and where it resides. And it's saying, knowing where your data resides, what about data found that is indexed into Splunk? So SIM solutions and centralized logging solutions. Once indexed, that data cannot be removed in isolation. They only let you remove all. It doesn't necessarily allow you to do a potential purge based on a request from a resident itself. And so from an operational management tool, it's difficult to abide by certain requests. What does that mean?
So that's a good question. And again, I think we're going to see how the enforcement comes down. But like we said, that there are exceptions in that right to erasure, the right to be forgotten article within the regulation. So in our interpretation, and in the interpretations we've gotten from partners as well, that will predominantly fall under some of those legal exceptions, that as long as you're proving adequate compensating controls to that solution, to that platform, you should be okay under compliance with GDPR.
Absolutely. So remember, you have to show that you adequately were able to comply with the request that's being given to you. And so for certain limitations when it comes to technology or what have you, obviously you're not able to go ahead and purge said data from your logs themselves, but just making sure that you're following the detailed privacy program that you've set for GDPR in order to comply. And so it all comes down to what can you justify and show that you've taken reasonable efforts based on the tools, processes, and individuals that you have available to you in order to comply with certain requests and the regulation as a whole. That's very, very key to all of this. And it's all about documenting it as clear as possible and as explicit as possible in a privacy program, which we'll cover in a little bit. So there's another question in regards to data and how it's stored. And the question is, do the backups also need to be erased within 72 hours?
The understanding is 72 hours is the intent without undue delay, is more of the specific language around there. So as long what we have interpreted as, and again, like we said, some of our partners who are on the ground in the EU as well, as long as you can show continual progress that you are doing that, that you can provide updates to potential requesters, data subjects, you should be okay. I think it's stepping from what's live in the environment to then moving into the backups is going to be the key progression there.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, reasonability. So what can you feasibly do within your organization in order to comply with the requirement as a whole? They're not expecting you to pull, backup tapes from 6 years ago in order to purge, certain data from your environment. The expectation would just be, hey, if you need to do a restore from those backup tapes, you have some kind of protocol or procedure in place in order to purge, that resident information before you restore it in your production environment. So it's having certain protocols in place like that, which is why you're seeing a lot of these regulations come down to IT and security processes. It's not just about legal and compliance. Now we have one more question before we move on to the next slide, which I know there's a couple more questions about. Does GDPR apply to a bank that only operates in the US? And I believe we answered the other follow-up questions of, who enforces it and how is compliance checked, because there is going to be a certification process. But if you can answer that, does it apply to a bank that only operates in the US?
Depends on if you're providing services to an EU data subject. That's kind of that's the short and long of it. If you are providing a service to an EU data subject, and remember that's a resident or a citizen at the time of the collection, you will have to comply. Again, then it goes to how enforceable is some of this going to be on U.S. companies. We'll have to see in highly regulated industries like the banking industry. Everyone's going to see what happens and how it evolves, and how it's enforced. But yes, you would adhere to the regulation.
Absolutely. So maybe let's go on to the next slide, which really is around what is considered personal data, and then I'll field a couple more questions that we have going on.
Sure. So personal data really is everything that identifies an individual. So we're talking about telephone numbers, we're talking about date of birth, photographs, IP addresses, other geo indicators, and at the European level, the protection of that data is covered by these two directives. Now, the Data Protection Directive is now known as GDPR. And then we also have the e-privacy directive on electronic communication. So that is what we're talking about when we are considering personal data here.
Yeah, so if you can identify an individual from the data you're collecting, it's in scope for GDPR.
Yeah.
So it's name, email, like we're saying, photographs. So photographs are included in scope. Now we have a question, now that we've gone over, really what is personal data considered as part of GDPR? It's really, how do you perceive GDPR impacting existing global security policies for global companies?
We believe that GDPR is going to start setting the precedent. Everyone, as we're talking through this today, we've talked about this with a variety of organizations as well. Everyone's waiting for how GDPR is truly going to be enforced. We're all aware of it, and we'll touch on it briefly at the end, but GDPR is right now the new kid on the block. everyone's focused on it. But we have updates in China to their cybersecurity law, Australia, Japan. There's so many others that this is going to be seen as a precedent. And I think what we point out is that a lot of what GDPR is calling on organizations to do is to just have better data hygiene, to put in better processes, to just operate more efficiently, more effectively, and drive your bottom line in the services to your customers. So if you kind of take that perspective, not solely from compliance, but this is going to help our business have a strategic advantage, we believe that that's actually probably one of the best ways to approach GDPR moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at the global impact, just for organizations that, whether you're global or not, if you're doing any kind of business with, an EU partner or support, EU residents, it will affect security policy. And that's where we start recommending, and you'll see in our recommendations, but I'll just kind of jump ahead a little bit, is building your privacy program, your security program, your policies themselves, not just to match GDPR, because as David was just saying, this is just the beginning of privacy laws and regulations that are coming out in various countries, Australia, China, Japan. They're all at the heels, and China's already in place, but all these other ones are at the heels of GDPR. It's build your security policies around a framework. And so when you look at frameworks that are comprehensive enough to be able to account for not only the regulations, laws, and privacy requirements of today, but those that are coming down the pipeline in the future in order to protect personal data, there's two particular frameworks that match very well to account for this. So you're building your programs out holistically, so you're not constantly changing them. And that is ISO 27001, and that is ISO 27018. ISO 27001 is specific to security. It is a holistic program in order to define your security stance, your policies, your controls, the program as a whole, and how you govern it. And then ISO 27018 is actually an addendum to 27001 that focuses strictly on privacy and cloud. And you can see why I definitely recommend that, everyone, if you're not familiar with it, look at those two, because it is a very comprehensive framework that is open and flexible to organizations. It's not, demanding very specific requirements, but it leaves it open to make you think about how do you design your program, what should be in your policies, what does it look like as a whole, so that you can develop this. You're not constantly every single month or every 6 months changing your governance in order to meet the latest and greatest regulation that comes out.
Exactly. All right. So what are the specific requirements? All right, so we've touched on a lot of this stuff, but this is where we want to go into it in a little bit more depth. So if you do have questions, let's make this as dynamic a discussion as possible. So the right to erasure, also known as the right to be forgotten, is listed under Article 17. Now, what we want to point out here is we had talked about exceptions. So the exceptions to this are if a request starts to impede on freedom of expression, public health information, scientific and historical research or legal claims, the data subjects, their request does not have to be met. And again, that will have to be removed. You have to remove all of that information without undue delay.
So undue delay, again, what are your reasonable efforts associated with that? And that's why we put it in quotes. So if, there's no specific, time frame, yes, 72 hours is the recommended time frame. However, they specify it as without undue delay. So as long as you build your program around what you can feasibly do and you meet those SLAs, that is what is important.
Precisely. So opt-in and privacy by design, or as it's called in the regulation, data protection by default. So this is a notable change for U.S. organizations, as we said earlier. We're transitioning from this opt-out consent mindset to an opt-in and these privacy by design requirements. So unlike unlike in the US, you will need to gain that consent prior to collecting data subjects. Now, this opt-in of consent can actually be as simple as changing a security setting in your browser, clicking on a radio button. The radio button cannot be pre-checked. That's, again, where you're starting to see these little nuances. And then the regulation calls out different categories of data. So there's what's deemed a special category of data. Now, these special categories are particular to healthcare, really. So it's PHI, biometric. Now, if you are collecting that type of information, you will need to gain explicit consent, meaning oral or written permission. Now, that doesn't mean you have to start taking this stuff offline. You can do this in your interface. You can do this right in the UI, and that's to your discretion how you want to you want to do that. Now, what's interesting is we're talking about privacy by design and data protection by default. So what the regulation also calls out in part of the consent is user experience. So you actually are not supposed to inhibit providing the service to your customer. So we start to kind of see how we have to blend all of this, how all of it requires a new mindset about how we're particularly going to design some of these consent modules and how we, take the data collection process in there as a whole. And we recommend you look at Article 7 and 25 to kind of gain a little bit more of an understanding around that. Any questions on that?
Nope, not yet.
Okay, great. And then Article 55 is the breach notification standards. So again, this is going to be somewhat in conflict with US, state, and industry standards. But processors and controllers are required to notify the supervisory authority without undue delay, which in this means 72 hours. That is called out.
Mm-hmm.
There is no exception to that.
I mean, but this is something that a lot of organizations, when we look at the impact of GDPR and the requirements and everything to organizations, this one specifically, breach notification standard, is, I would say, the least impactful because most organizations do have, robust breach notification standards in place and protocols.
Yep.
In the U.S. specifically, we're used to notifying the attorney generals if it meets a certain threshold and having that open dialogue and communication. This is something that's very similar to it, but there's a stricter timeline associated with it, that 72-hour timeline, and that's very, very important to note, and that needs to be accounted for within the breach notification process or organization.
Yeah, and then another thing to keep in mind is that you may not even have to. First off, we're also talking about a single data subject, which is somewhat new, but you may not actually have to notify the data subject of the breach as long as the remediation that you have stated to the supervisory authority is that much more stringent and secure to protect that data than it was before.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing to keep in mind. And then the data protection officer, again, call out in Article 37. It's required, but again, you may not have to have this person full-time. If one of your core business activities is processing data, and understand that processing data means any type of change or procedure that's done to the data, you will need to have a full-time on-staff DPO in your office. If that's not the case, or you have a smaller organization where this could impede on business, you're allowed to essentially share a DPO or use a VDPO service, a virtual data protection officer. And that will enable you to have someone who meets this requirement, can establish those relationships with the supervisory authority, stay abreast to any changes or new precedents with the enforcement of GDPR moving forward. And this is not, if you want further guidance and precedence on how this is potentially going to be actually enacted, Germany's laws have had the requirements of the data protection officer for some time. So those are pretty good guidance as to what the SA's supervisory authorities are going to be looking for.
And so that's key. So you can actually have a virtual DPO So if you want to go ahead and partner with, law firm and security firm in order to, meet the requirements, because there are specific requirements on who can be designated as a DPO. It's not like we have in the States where you have on paper, a chief information security officer, or you have on paper a privacy officer, just because you need it for liability standpoint and regulation. This DPO needs to meet certain requirements, and those requirements, I believe there's about a half dozen. They are called out in the regulation itself, that this person needs to meet a certain set of qualifications in order to be identified as such.
Yes, and the funny thing is not many people are going to actually meet some of those qualifications. So the partnership between legal and an IT security firm is actually probably going to be the best bet. Okay, so data mapping, data classification, and data minimization.
This is the beast.
This is the beast, and this really drives everything, and where we think it becomes a real advantage to just having these processes in place. So all really we're talking about here is understanding what you have in place. It's the first and foremost thing that you need to ensure you do as you start building out your program and trying to meet compliance with GDPR. Understand what you have, understand where it is, and understand why it's there. And that's kind of really going to be the key. Is GDPR is calling out this idea of data minimization all over the place. That's what they want. They don't want you to excessively collect information. But from our standpoint, that actually makes perfect business sense. If you have multiple terabytes of data, whatever it may be, the ability to analyze that may not be as effective to you as if you can streamline that and align that to specific business units, to specific services. It's going to be more effective for you just as a business as a whole. So starting to apply those criteria and that mindset is going to be vital. So, having a strong data mapping process that is continuous, where you're doing the interviews, you're doing, with all of the vital units, marketing, human resources, R&D, those areas of the business where sensitive information could exist. That's where you're going to start to see the compliance, the breadth of the compliance kind of drop in its severity, and your strategic output kind of jump up.
Yeah, and this honestly, this is definitely by far the most challenging one across all the requirements, just because of that data mapping. So data classification is a core requirement of any regulation, of any law, of any standard. However, the U.S. has typically, most U.S. companies don't do a very good job of data classification in their organization, because it is a pain in the butt.
Yeah.
So what we're looking at now is this is calling out for specifically the foundation is data classification first before you can even do data mapping. And so data mapping becomes obviously significantly more difficult, whether automated or manual, if you do not have data classification in place.
Yeah. And
then it's also a partnership of data minimization of, it's not just an IT security thing, it's not a legal thing, it's not a compliance thing, it's a business thing.
Yep.
And so it's that joint partnership throughout the organization to try and minimize what is collected and how long it's stored for, so it decreases your data classification efforts and it simplifies your data mapping across the board.
Exactly.
Cool. So I know we've only have 15 minutes left, so maybe we can go through some of this quickly and then jump onto the rest.
Yeah, so the next three really in a lot of ways kind of connect. So you have vendor management, you've got risk management and risk assessment, and you've got the continuous monitoring. So we talked about continuous monitoring in the sense of the codes of conduct. You also are supposed to be able to show data subjects a record of processing activities. Now this is for them to be able to essentially determine if they want to request an erasure. Also, that they can compel you to update and accurately define their data within your environment as well. So that can be compelled of you. And then vendor management is really, we're talking about the fact that both processors and controllers have those obligations. If a processor sees that a controller is not grabbing appropriate consent, you are obligated as your processor to do so. As the controller, you're supposed to put upon your processors and ensure that they're meeting those adequate controls. And that's where those certifications and codes of conduct can come into place to give you, as a controller, a little bit of confidence, calm, that this stuff is getting met.
Well, it's also too, contractual agreements. So the language that you've drafted in your contracts and your MSAs, what have you, probably should be slightly modified to account for GDPR, and ensuring that they meet or exceed the requirements in place, and that they provide evidence of such, requirements that they're meeting in the controls that are there, and call it out, because it is a trickle-down effect that your vendors that you're dealing with do need to comply as well. If EU resident data, they have access to it, or it resides in whatever services that you're purchasing or partnering with them on. Yeah. It's also, modifying your existing vendor management program when it comes to security process to look at if they're storing data and they're directly collecting it, that you need to understand what their data mapping process is, what their data minimization efforts are, and how they're protecting that data and where it resides and what it looks like. So it's almost like creating kind of a subsection within your vendor management program that says, hey, are you applicable, to GDPR, based on this data? If yes, answer this additional section and start to call out these particular requirements that we're going through. Yeah, and making sure that your third parties actually know that they do need to comply, because a lot of them at this point don't feel that they are within the compliance requirements. But for the most part, they are, specifically if they're supporting you and you as a controller need to be. Absolutely. And so the risk management and risk assessment, it's really an open-ended series of articles that really are saying that you need to have, adequate security and protection in place, and be aware of, those risks that have an internal, external impact to the data that you're collecting and those residents. So they want to make sure that you are maintaining and being proactive about your GDPR program and looking at it holistically so that you can improve upon the controls in place, which obviously then has a direct effect into continuous monitoring, which is always looking at a maturity and improving the controls that you have based on the risks that are identified, based on the feedback that you're getting from the vendors, and really based on the business's needs within your organization of how they are capturing data, what data they need, and how the mapping efforts that you see in your organization are constantly playing out, and how that's being reported across the board, which is why the three of those are so intertwined with each other. Completely. All right. Cool. There is one question before we go on. So the one question is a data center in the U.S. in scope for GDPR if they have EU private data, but they are not the controller? Yeah, one more time. Essentially, if a data center is in the U.S., the data center is located in the U.S., it's storing EU resident information or EU data subject information, but they're not considered a controller. As a processor, they are. Yeah. Okay. Sounds good. Okay. So we briefly touched on preparation, but we believe these are the 5 priority preparations that you can kind of put into place. So the data mapping and a privacy impact assessment. This exercise is really going to help you understand what is in your environment, what is in your databases, why is it, and really hopefully that pushes you to understand why it's even there. If you don't need it, let's get rid of it. That's that purge. And this is really going to create a vantage point that you need to ensure that you are building your programs adequately and you understand truly if you do need to comply with GDPR, because there could be a misinterpretation. You don't know. Yeah, so the privacy impact assessment is literally your first touch point to say, how is GDPR applicable to me? What does it really look like? Where does my data reside? What are businesses using this for? And then looking at the controls that are applicable to you. Now, there is a particular framework that organizations can use in order to conduct this privacy impact assessment, and that is ISO 22307. Yep. It was originally designed for doing a privacy impact against financial institutions and financial data. However, it's the exact same principle of what we're talking about right now. Instead of just honing in on financial data, you're honing in on anything that is personally identifiable to an EU resident. So it's a good framework to go ahead and take a look at when conducting a privacy impact assessment.
Yeah. And then the next thing is having the conversations and understanding what your third-party providers have, what they're doing, what controls they have in place, and doing that through the lens of GDPR. You want to make sure that they have modern data protection controls in place, especially as so many of us are in cloud and hybrid architectures. And then we've been talking about this a lot recently, but the certification, potentially looking at gaining a certification or just adhering or aligning to one of these frameworks. So we're talking about ISO 27001, which, as Christina stated, is the development of an information security management system, as well as the addendum, or its kind of, I don't know, cousin, I guess we can call it, 27018, which is cloud and privacy. So starting to adhere to those international standards is going to help companies best put the proper controls into place. And then kind of in conjunction with data mapping and the third-party providers and everything is data retention, understanding what needs to be retained and why. Remember, there are, when it comes to right to erasure, there are exceptions. If there's a legal requirement that supersedes everything, that you need to retain that data, then you're going to be okay. You just need to make sure that you have the proper controls in place. And then number 5 is starting to understand the landscape, really. It's who are the supervisory authorities in the regions or in the member states that you're actually operating or providing services to. And a lot of that's going to be guided by the data mapping process that you're going to go through. That's going to determine, oh, we didn't know we had, the UK and Germany. We didn't know that, France and Spain, those data subjects were inside of our environment. So you need to make sure that you are reaching out and understanding, because there is collaboration between these supervisory authorities to ensure that there is a harmonized enforcement approach. Any questions on these?
No, I'm actually fielding questions as they come up.
Perfect. Okay. So we talked about this. There is a competitive advantage to GDPR. We believe that the first one is privacy by design. Just having that viewpoint, showing customers and even your employees, personnel data falls under this compliance as well, that you care about their privacy, protecting their personal data. That's going to go a long way. The partnerships, you're going to need to continue to build strong partnerships. That's not something that you wouldn't have to do outside of GDPR existing. We're all utilizing third-party providers in a cloud-based environment at this point. So developing stronger partnerships and understanding what we have. Third is the data minimization. That just really goes to how effectively you can utilize and leverage your data that you are collecting to provide the services that you are paid to provide. Forward-looking security. Again, this kind of goes to the idea that GDPR is the first. It's the first main, real, comprehensive update to data protection in the modern era. And it's going to drive, and it already has started to provide insight and guidance in how China started to provide some of their stuff. How Japan, Australia, Brazil, you work in, if you're down in Latin America, it's coming from all different angles. So the more you can start to agree and apply these new developments, the better you're going to be. And then brand equity, and that goes, that kind of just brings everything together. The more compliant you are, the better. The more that you show your customers you care about the protection of their personal data, the better off you're going to be. And and that's from a global perspective. That could open up new markets potentially for you, even if you're not looking to go into certain markets at this point.
Absolutely.
All right. And then we've been talking about it, but again, we can just drive it home. So China, Australia, Canada, APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, as well as Japan. We've got Qatar, Singapore, Malaysia, and Brazil, and a bunch of others. And we're going to continue to see this kind of evolve. So just keeping a watchful eye that GDPR is going to create, hopefully, a precedent and maybe make some of us do some, let's call it grunt work at this point, to ensure compliance. But long term, that's going to make all of these other pivots to different compliance requirements that much easier and that much more seamless.
Yeah, and that's why it's, the overall recommendation as you're building out these programs and looking at complying with GDPR is building that holistic, security program, privacy program, so that way you're not changing it every single time a new regulation comes out from a country that you operate in. It'll take a little bit more work up front. However, it'll be significantly more beneficial for you in the long run. Perfect. So, obviously GDPR is a partnership between, everybody in the organization. It's not just a legal thing, a privacy, a security, or a compliance effort that needs to undertake. It's everyone that needs to partner together in order to achieve it. And that partnership needs to be built in really committees or working groups established so that you can work towards these goals to ensure that you comply. And then obviously meeting with the business and doing those data mapping exercises. I know we are at time. I'm sure there's probably more questions that may arise or some that we haven't responded to yet. So if you do have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to David and myself so that we can go ahead and respond to you and provide you whatever information or references that we can to help you through this effort. There's been many questions around, are we going to share the slide deck? The answer is yes. So everybody that has registered, we will email you a copy of the slide deck so that you can refer to it, so you don't have to memorize all those articles, all those ISO certifications and frameworks, etc. So we will email that out to everybody. But with that, I think we're right at time. Thank you everybody for attending this afternoon. We will email out the slides. Feel free and email David or I or both of us with any additional questions that you may have now or in the future regarding GDPR and what this looks like. And appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the week.